Hello Proponomics people, and welcome to the Sunday supplement summary from the supplement that was released on the 31st of March 2024. And this one was, seasonally enough, entitled Happy Easter. So, Happy Easter to all, first of all, of course. And this article really took the form of a pretty typical macro roundup, but on a very quiet week. And then I did a bit of a deep dive into three different reports that were available. So one was the ONS monthly rental market report that they produce. That's from the ONS, and their new measure of private rents. So the PIPR, which has replaced their old rental index, which really, apart from anything else, simply wasn't very good. And that was by their own admission. I then looked at another monthly report, which comes out from Zoopla. And the Zoopla monthly rental market report is a very useful one to read, and I'm a big fan of Richard Donnell's work, the exec director there of research, and he produces some good stuff, but always a few little nuances to pick out and a few things I don't quite agree with. I don't think they've quite got their analysis bang on the money, but there's always some really good stuff in there, really thought-provoking stuff. And then the last one is the Bank of England Financial Stability Report. So there is a Financial Stability Committee that forms part of the Bank of England's remit. They meet every quarter, and so with it being the end of quarter one, it was a quarterly end of report. So some quite interesting stuff. So what are we seeing at the moment in the broader marketplace as well? We're seeing that completions are going forward. Sales agreed are looking pretty good. I follow Chris Watkins' stats, and I think it's a very, very good idea for anybody interested in more real-time stuff on the UK property market and the health of the retail market specifically. It's not something I spend a lot of time transacting in because I tend to buy from auction and from wholesale, but ultimately I'm trying to get my properties revalued at the retail prices, and most of the business, like in every industry, goes on at the retail price, and therefore it's well worth keeping abreast of those. At the moment, I reckon we're on track for about a 3% rise in the price of property by the time we get to around about August, September this year. So we're on course for where I think the market's going to be at. I think we'll have a bit of a stall when we come nearer the election, but that's what we're seeing at the moment. So that's all good stuff. And then macro metrics wise, I looked at the CBI Distributive Trade Survey. It printed a +2. That's a retail survey, and that's the best print we've had for there was 10 negative months before that. However, probably not a reason to be putting the bunting out just yet. It was just one of those where it's all blamed on the fact that Easter's come earlier this year, so that brings forward retailers' fortunes into March from April. Last year, April was a positive print. When that drops out the figures and there's no Easter in April, because it's already happened in March, then the figures are going to be going back down again. But the way I see that quite simply is we've had a big tear up in 2020, 2021 during lockdown for retail. Of course, that was online retail. It was absolutely booming at the time. 5 or 10 years growth all in one go, just like that. And then, of course, the market adjusted when you could go back and spend money on leisure activities, hospitality activities, travelling, all of that sort of stuff that you weren't allowed to do during the lockdowns. That exploded, and all the extra goods that you'd bought, your hot tubs, your Peloton bikes, all the rest of it, weren't so much needed anymore. So maybe not too much to read into the distributive trades being a positive, but we'd always rather a positive than a negative. Bond and swap markets were absolutely dull as anything this week, the dullest I've seen for a very, 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 very long time, which I think is absolutely ideal. And I'd love to see some more of that, because that's what we want to see in the bond and swap markets. I think we had a range of under 10 basis points that we were trading in all week, basically between 3.8 and 3.9. And the swaps closed the week on just over 3.75%. So remember, the swaps are, we're talking about the 5-year swaps here. That's the price from which the mortgage rates are based. So lenders need to make a bit of a margin on that 3.75. So that comes up to about 5.75 roughly, which is slightly below some of the stuff that's being offered at the moment. But if you've been following the news on the finance front this week, you'll have seen lots and lots of places announcing cuts in their mortgage rates, because we've had basically a 0.2 drop, which looks very, very stable. The stability indices at the moment, the volatility indices are very, very low indeed. So let's say, fingers crossed, for the moment, we're back to business as usual when it comes to the bond and swap markets, which is lots of volume being traded at prices that look nearly the same day in, day out, with, I would suggest, a very, very, very slow decay being baked in at the moment. This all works while we're in the middle of this attempted soft landing or no landing that the economy is going to make after all that money that was pumped in during COVID. Still something that niggles me about that, and I still can't quite manage to technically put my finger on it, but I still see it as less than a 50% chance we're going to get away with it. But every day we get away with it, then the chance of us getting away with it permanently goes up and up and up, so it's all good. Then GDP, there was first pass of the revision. We know that Q4 23 was down 0.3%, and that started this technical recession that we're now, at the end of Q1, absolutely certain is over, because we haven't had any huge disasters that are going to mess anything up, and it'd be a big surprise if the UK economy hasn't returned to growth. I'm guessing 0.4 is my forecast for Q1 2024. Would be a bit more actually, but the bank holiday on Good Friday probably doesn't help, although Easter being brought forward does help out a bit with GDP, but we'll have the same problem in Q2. There won't have been Easter, so you see where that happens. Q2 kicks off with a bank holiday, but normally it would have two, so that's about 0.25% boost to the GDP from the start, which is pretty helpful apart from anything else. So business investment as well moved forward in Q4 2023, up for the year, up for the quarter, 2.8% up year on year. Jeremy Hunt's throwing the kitchen sink at this one. Rachel Reeves making some good noises. If Labour are to win the election, as all the betting suggests at the moment, then I'm hopeful that Labour's working collaboratively with the private sector to bring investment in will be good work. I'm very, very hopeful on that front. Otherwise, we've got no money to get from anywhere else as it goes, unless we're going to make some huge cuts, which I can't see the Labour Party doing, because the number one thing they'll have to go after is the health service, and the number two thing would be the pension system, and both of those are political footballs that no one ever wants to touch, despite the fact that they desperately need to. So let's hope we can get some projects on the go that work out really well. So I'm going to crack on with Zoopla's rental market report. What did they say? 7.8% annual rental inflation for new lets, 20% down year on year in rental demand. That's massive, but rental demand was so big last year, and perhaps this just speaks to how the immigration landscape is changing, and that's a big part of it, because 20% down from a ridiculous all-time high, and 51% of rentals now rent at over £1,000 a month, which blew me away a bit, to be honest with you. That's huge. So 20% more rentals available than a year ago, still below the pre-pandemic average though, so more stock available, less demand. Good news for tenants. This is why the pressures are starting to ease on the huge rent increases. London rent inflation down to 5.3. That was a huge drop from where it was last year, well in the teens last year. So I would just add one thing. This is the report for the end of March, and we're about to see massive minimum wage increase, which is going to percolate upwards through the system and push wages up throughout as a general rule. And Scotland's still leading the way with what's going on in their year-on-year rental growth, 11.6%. Absolute idiocy from the anti-landlord ideologues that are running that show at the moment. Green Party are just not helping the situation at all, and they just cannot see, because they're too ideological, that what they're doing is hurting the tenant. And it's very sad, very, very sad. And I just hope that they will learn at some point that they need a different approach to the PRS in Scotland, but I'm not holding my breath. So, one of the things the report said that made me smile was only a rapid expansion in supply will start to improve affordability for UK renters. It's just not going to be happening, is it? We've got 12 voids to rent per average agent compared to 16 before the pandemic. The market is bigger, apart from anything else, because of the large influx of people we've had into the country since then. And then ultimately, we've got 15 inquiries for each home to rent, which is more than double the pre-pandemic numbers. Anecdotally, my agent in Scotland that looks after the vast majority of the properties we've got up there, they are reporting on a portfolio of 500 units. They've got 2 voids at the moment, 2. I mean, that is how ridiculous things are up there. And this is not in the most incredibly buoyant area of Scotland in reality. It's in sort of the Ayrshire way, although they do manage some stock in and around Glasgow. So, East of England reports that over 70% of properties are over £1,000 a month in rent now, up from 24% in 2020. So pretty incredible. Build to rent now numbers 90,000. The number I was seeing of completed units was about 75. That's moved up to 90, which is good news, but let's not be too blasé about it, because none of us would mind a 90,000 unit portfolio, but it's really a complete drop in the bucket compared to the size of the PRS. And how many of those are useful homes that are, for example, 3-bed semis near schools that people want to send their children to? Very, 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 very few indeed, let's face it. Zoopla see rental inflation at 4 to 5% this year. I think they're too low. But I'm looking at provincial, they're looking at nationwide, and obviously London is dragging things down a bit. So if London did calm down to a couple of percent by the end of the year or went a bit flat, that would bring down the nationwide figure. I'm thinking rent inflation of more like 7 this year. And when you see the ONS report, you'll see why I think that. So a couple of bits that I think are pretty useful. There's not going to be this sustained expansion in available supply, I don't think, but in individual cities you might well see falling rents because there's quite often oversupply in certain cities. You can see that all the time. Everybody wants to develop in the city centre for whatever reason. Perhaps everybody thinks they do the best job, better than any other developer, and that's why they can sell their city centre units, but that's probably a bit of a silly way to look at it. And of course as well, there's very little new investment, and we know that's still going on because the last quarter's mortgage data showed that only £1 in every £14 being lent was for rental. That compares to the historical 10-15 year averages of £1 in every 7 or 8. So double, we're basically half what we normally have in terms of mortgages in the buy-to-let sector because prices are too high and things don't stack up. And there are other factors, of course, as well. Outside of London, Zoopla's figures are 9% for new rents. So it just shows you we may well be actually on completely the same track. I then looked at the bank summary. What did they have to say about the financial policy stability? Overall conditions remain challenging. Nobody will be too surprised to hear that. I'm not sure they've increased a lot during this quarter. Actually, they've bubbled up, they've bubbled down. There are terrorist concerns, of course, that we haven't seen for a while. But that's not normally a geopolitical event that will shape markets in such a big way. The bank highlights that asset prices are stretched in financial markets. I'd agree with that, apart from in property at the moment. You're seeing a big tear up, Bitcoin, gold, stock markets. But if you apply inflation to all of those things in a sensible way and look at the real pricing, it still doesn't look too ridiculous as yet. And of course, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. We all know that. So, UK households and businesses have been resilient so far. I'm a bit concerned here about the bank thinking we're basically nearly job done in this hiking cycle and we've absorbed everything. Whereas it's just not true because a lot of the debt that's rolling, people's debt position is getting worse every day on a household level because we've got, million plus, we've got maybe 100,000 fixed rate mortgages dropping off every month. Significantly makes a difference to people's disposable income. Although the bank's analysis is it's under control, it still has to affect consumption on an ongoing basis. And while new mortgages are still at a higher rate than the stock of the existing debt, then that problem is just going to keep on going in the background. Bit of a carbon monoxide situation, basically. And then UK bank resilience. The Bank of England think that the banks are resilient, but they would say that because that's their job. Although having said that, I do believe we're doing a lot better job than we did before the bank was independent. So I'll wrap up this week with the ONS's rebadged price index of private rents, or the PIPR. It's a bit quicker release-wise. It's going to come out with the inflation figures, which is great. The data in this series only goes back to 2015, so we've only really got 9 years of data, so I don't think we can read too much into that particularly. The ONS's other data only goes back to 2005 on rentals, so they're late to the party. But then the buy-to-let mortgage only really appeared in 1996, so perhaps 2005 wasn't a ridiculous pace for a governmental organisation to move at. Maybe not. But the ONS are reporting 9.0% in the last 12 months. That's the highest it's ever been. It's lagging the inflation high in the economy of 11.1 from October 22 by nearly a full 18 months, which is very, very typical for rent inflation. It tends to come much later on. So perhaps no surprise. What I did then is I put together some of Zoopla and HomeLet's figures on new lets, because they only measure new lets, and the ONS's figures. And that means existing rents and existing tenancies are moving up about 9.4% year on year, because the new rents for the first time in a while are below what the existing rents are doing. So existing rents are being pushed up slowly as landlords recover the the holes in their finances that massive increases in interest rates have left, apart from anything else. Average rent in England now over £1,275. Average rent in Scotland now nearly £950. Then they have, the ONS, private rent inflation in London at 10.6 over the past 12 and 5.7 in the northeast. So if you put together Zoopla's new let, particularly low, 5.3% for London, which is low at the moment, with this 10.6, you can see that the existing tenants are really carrying the burden at 11% plus rises in their rents in London as well, on those huge rents that are already there in London. So very, very painful stuff. But about as painful as the average household with a mortgage, to be honest with you, or slightly less. That would be about 150 quid rent increase in the average place in London, nearly 200, whereas the average mortgage increase, according to the Bank of England's analysis, was about 250 quid. But then, of course, the average renting household has a lower average income than the average property owning household. So the effect is probably still disproportionate on the tenant, I'm afraid. So I did a little worked example of what some of this means in terms of what's happened just over the past 12 months in the rental market. If you had at the end of 2022 a house worth 100k with a rent of £600 a month, that yields 7.2%. Using the ONS's figure for December 23, which was a drop in house prices of 2.2%, that same house at the end of 23 was worth 97,800. Using the rent inflation figure, that would put rent up to £654 a month, and that would move the yield from 7.2 to 8.02, which is actually a relative increase of 11.14% in the yields overall. This is massive. This hasn't been happening for years. The yields have been trending down and down and down and down and down as property price increases have vastly outstripped rent inflation, certainly from 2016 onwards, and then massively during 2020 and 2021. Now rent's catching up a bit and yields are changing, and this is what's needed to get landlords back in the market in order that they can cope, just from a mathematical perspective, with the cost of mortgage debt at the moment. And that's where we are. So obviously that needs active asset management to happen. Typical rent inflation is lagging normal inflation by about 12 or 18 months or so. We must be close to the peak at this point, but this really justifies why I think we've got rent increases of 25% over the next 5 years coming up. I think that's where we'll be. I also think that's roughly where capital growth will be, interestingly enough. Most of this is inflation inspired stuff, most of it. Will be interesting to see what the minimum wage is set at for April 2025, because obviously today is the day where it's moved up by 9.8% apart from anything else, increasing the cost to employers of minimum wage staff by 11.5%. And anyone who doesn't think that's going to be inflationary, give your head a wobble, don't be ridiculous. All that money gets spent, normally speaking. Let's see what happens. So I finished off with a bit of an Easter egg of a pep talk, really. It's been slow going at the moment. 1 week the market feels easy, the next week it feels hard. But look, just keep going, keep following up, turn up, be consistent, do what you said you were going to do. That's what gets the deals done. Tenacity, resilience, and drive. So it only remains me to say what I say at the end of every supplement summary: keep calm and carry on.